Mothership is a tabletop RPG that stood out in late 2021 when it raised $1.4 million on Kickstarter. The game had previously been a free game that you could download and print as a couple pamphlets, but this Kickstarter edition set out to tighten up a few rules as well as present a more deluxe physical presentation and offer all the best published modules, some of which had won awards over the years. That older free edition has been referred to as Zero Edition, and this newer Kickstarted version is known as the First Edition, or Mothership 1E. There have been plenty of foaming at the mouth Kickstarter backers who waited almost 3 years to get their deluxe box and printed game booklets, and some of them have vehemently denounced the publisher, Tuesday Night Games, as well as the game itself. But I'd like to formally ignore all of those people and focus on the important question here. Is Mothership 1E better than Free League's Alien RPG? I feel uniquely qualified to answer this question since I've run and played both games. I've interviewed the heads of both publishing companies, and you can read both interviews on my newsletter blog thing. I'll leave links down below. And as a bonus, I've also reviewed every Alien RPG supplement almost as soon as it has come out, as well as read all of the Mothership's greatest hits adventure modules. What I want to do in this video is walk you through the player's guide and GM guide for Mothership, just like I would with any review video, and then do a point-by-point comparison between Mothership and Free League's Alien. In the end, there can be only one winner. But spoiler alert, they're both pretty good games. And just to actually comment on this unboxing, the deluxe box is pretty remarkable in quality. As you've seen, it's got a lot of extra space for storing the actual stuff you might need for a game, like extra dice, pencils, and a few minis. The commitment to staying with staple-bound booklets here, rather than maybe a stitch-bound book, is a little jarring when compared with the quality of the physical box itself. But Tuesday Night Games wasn't keeping that fact a secret. They advertised staple-bound books, and that's what they delivered. It's like they took the zine format all the way to its limits in terms of high production value while still retaining the zine format. The game itself consists of 4 main booklets: the player's guide, GM's guide, a booklet detailing all the ship building and ship combat rules, and an overly creative monster manual, which I am not going to cover in this video. And then there are the 4 officially published, occasionally award-winning adventure modules. These are printed in color, which is nice, but they all have different internal layout sensibilities, so that's something you'll need to get used to when reading them and actually using them as a GM. Dead Planet is a favorite of mine since it's one I've run and gotten used to. Again, the internal layout can be a bit avant-garde with these, so it takes some getting used to. A Pound of Flesh is really one of the most remarkable of all the published modules for Mothership, but I have yet to run it myself. One thing you'll notice about this module and everything else that is officially published for Mothership is that they do not waste space on the page. Information is written tersely, with bolds and emphasis on key information for fast reference everywhere they can. Once you experience this approach to module presentation, there's no going back to text walls. Finally, there's Gradient Descent, another banger of a module. It's a shame that I'm not actually going through each of these 4 modules in this video. One of the dilemmas I have with covering published adventures is the issue of spoilers. I'd be doing everyone a disservice by revealing all the fun surprise elements. But as it happens, these modules have been around for a while now, and people have long spoiled the surprises on YouTube. But yeah, the deluxe box set is pretty remarkable. It was a long road for Tuesday Night Games, filled with production and shipping woes that do seem to plague most creators and publishers these days. But they crossed the finish line with this box, and it's a pretty neat accomplishment. Okay, so the player's survival guide is a 44-page booklet that contains all the actual rules of the game. I think the cover says a lot here, not just the fact that it's a person in a spacesuit with their rib cage splayed open and guts hanging out, but the fact that it's a rough sketch. And then you've got this artistic smudge corpse over here. This approach to artwork in the game is not for everyone. A lot of it is rough, but also a lot of it is very cool. One thing it is not is consistent. The one thing that is consistent is something I mentioned earlier, which is the information dense layout. And the density is clean and organized. Check out this breakdown of the character sheet. It's just intensely readable and absorbable. Also worth noting is the fact that the sheet for this game contains the character generation instructions on the sheet. Something that I think is done so that new players can be onboarded without being expected to read or know anything about the game. Although the creators didn't acknowledge H.R. Giger or any of the creatives who made the first couple of Alien movies, it is very apparent that this game takes a lot of its cues from those movies. Just look at this illustration. Also, you can play as one of 4 classes in the core game: a Marine, an Android, a Scientist, or a Teamster. I guess Scientists don't play a prominent role in the first 2 Alien movies, but these other 3 classes do. Here's the first place where you're going to see a reference to common sense rather than a hard and fast rule in this game. For carry capacity, they ask that you just do what makes sense, using real life as a guideline. Personally, I like this approach because long lists of prescriptive rules and mechanics about everything are just not fun to sort out in the middle of a session. But the call for common sense rulings in this game does get a little extreme in some cases. Here's a selection of weapons your character can use. At this point, you can probably see what I mean about the inconsistency in the artwork styles. I really love this manga style for the weapons, but you'll only see this particular style here and there throughout the books. As far as the stats for these weapons, they're mercifully short and simple. Alright, here's an official statement about this game needing you to be a game designer if you want to play it effectively. Basically, your table will need to house rule about 10% of the rules to get a complete game. I think for some people this would be a huge negative, especially those who bask in traditional RPGs structured like the ones from the 80s and 90s. It's a different approach, but not too radical these days actually. A lot of RPGs now are rules light, but most of the time they don't just come out and say that you have to design the last 10% of the game. They just imply it with the sparse rules. So here's how this game actually works. Your character has 4 core stats and 3 save ratings. Anytime you need to make a stat check, which usually covers what your character is trying to actively, voluntarily do, you roll a D100 and try to get under the stat being rolled. If you roll a 90 through 99, that's an automatic failure. And with a failure comes 1 point of stress, which we'll cover in a minute. The dice mechanic is identical when you're rolling a save, which you can think of as a reaction roll to something happening to your character. Your 3 saves are sanity, fear, and body. My only issue with fear is that it covers loneliness, depression, and other emotions, so the term fear is a bit of a misnomer. There are a couple of other things to note about dice rolls as well. This game utilizes advantage and disadvantage, where you roll twice and take the better or worse of the 2. And anytime you roll doubles, that's a critical success or critical failure, depending on if the underlying roll was a success or failure. Double zeros are always a critical success, and double 9s are always a critical failure. This approach ends up creating a fair amount of crits, since rolling doubles with 2d10s is not that rare, so this is pretty swingy in practice. Stress is the central mechanic of this game, which incidentally is also the central mechanic in Alien RPG, but I'll address that later. In Mothership, you are picking up stress quite frequently. Every time you fail a roll, you pick up a stress point. Even when you're trying to reduce stress with a rest save, if you fail that, you pick up stress. There are other ways to gain stress as well, and when you get past 20 stress, additional stress starts reducing the stat or save that you're rolling on, which is to say, your character starts to erode at the core if you don't manage the ever-growing stress points. Occasionally in the fiction, like when one of these things happens, a player must make a panic check, where they roll a d20 and try to roll more than their current stress. If they fail, then they check that roll against this table. I've seen these panic tables so many times now that I've just come to accept them as a subgenre of play. You usually see these in games of psychological horror where the fear or stress mounts to a breaking point. The problem with a lot of these tables is that they often ask players to fundamentally change how their character behaves. Fortunately, with this particular table, the panic penalties are more mechanical, or at least brief in nature, so there's not an ongoing burden on the player to roleplay some annoying psychological tick or anything. The one problem I ran into with panic checks generally is the fact that I had to ask players to roll over and with a d20, as opposed to the rest of the game, which is roll under with a D100. Mothership has a pretty cool way of presenting skills, which is through a branching tree of 3 tiers. At the lowest tier are skills that give you plus 10 to any roll that invokes that skill. The middle tier gives you plus 15, and the master skills give you plus 20. If you don't have a relevant skill on a check, then then you just don't add a bonus. You get some skills at character creation, but learning new skills is actually remarkably expensive and time consuming. You'll see this come up a lot in this game, where at its core, this is a survival horror game where the enemies are overpowered by design and you're almost meant to be maimed or killed. But then you have these elements like skills training that take 2 to 6 years. Another example I'll show you later is the ship building mechanics and the costs for repair. It's all exorbitantly expensive and leads to the question of, is your character even going to survive that long? The answer is that if your character can survive a session, the GM can fast forward the timeline of the story by a year or two between sessions until the next big event in your PC's lives, or just never pick up a new skill again. So here's what I'm talking about. Violence in Mothership is incredibly dangerous and should be avoided at all costs. Any players coming fresh from Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition is going to find this a hard pill to swallow, but the game is designed with OSR sensibilities. Here it says, treat every round like a completely unique situation and try not to look at your character sheet too much. Outsmart, outrun, and outlast your enemy. This is essentially the mantra of OSR gameplay, to treat each situation as a logic puzzle or problem that requires all of the players, intellect, deduction, and reasoning, not your characters. Here's a rules approach that I find really refreshing about this game up here. Characters can generally move somewhere within close range and then do one thing before the situation changes. That's the turn economy in this game. You can move some and then do a thing. I don't really know if a brand new GM would have the instinct to know what this means. It's possible that this kind of cavalier approach to turn economy only works because a GM has already played or run countless other games where slow actions and fast actions, main actions and free actions have been defined for them over and over to the point that they can just freestyle it now. Combat in the game works like, okay, I just have to point out this illustration here. I'm not sure what they were thinking here, but this doesn't really work for me. Anyway, combat in this game always boils down to a combat check, combat being one of your 4 core stats. If your combat check succeeds, then you roll the weapon's damage and subtract that from the target's HP. But if you fail, then you take a point of stress, which makes sense because you always take a point of stress when you fail a roll. But as you might imagine, stress really piles on in a fight. As far as damage, you subtract it from your health, and when that reaches 0, you roll on the wounds table and reset your health to max. Once you've filled up all your wounds, you roll a death save. I think the wounds table is particularly sophisticated in this game because it actually breaks down wounds by category. You're not just rolling for some random wound that you have to retcon into the fiction. As far as death saves, it's pretty theatrical. The GM rolls a d10 and hides the result until someone in the fiction checks on your dying character. And then when they turn you over, the d10 roll is revealed and you have to consult the death table. You have a 50% chance of just being dead and a 20% chance of being comatose for the long run. The game has lots of environmental hazards like low or no oxygen atmospheres, cryosickness, food and water management, and radiation. I think if you're planning on running this game and you want to employ these survival hazards, it's worth either designing or trying to find a sheet that can help you track all of this stuff. Because if you, as the GM, don't track it consistently throughout a session, the results range from meaningless to maybe unfair for players. I personally like tracking this stuff carefully because it's an important point of pressure on players, aside from the monsters and other enemies, which are often too deadly to spring on them with any frequency. As with a lot of places in this game, the rule for short-term recovery is sort of swingy and based on chance. If you rest for 6+ hours, you roll a body save and either get all of your health back or none at all. This is probably a good time to point out that the game's creators repeatedly invite you to change the rules of this game as you see fit, and this is a place where I just skip the dice roll and give players full health after a long rest. Recovery from wounds, conditions, and stat damage is a different story. The medical treatments table illustrates a strong theme in this game, which is that your character can probably only barely afford proper medical care. Shore leave is an important phase of gameplay, provided the PCs even survive long enough to make it to shore leave. All shore leave takes place on starports, and those vary in quality and cost. But if the PCs can afford entry, then they have a chance to convert stress into improvements in one of their 3 save stats. This is one of the main ways to improve a PC. There are no character levels in Mothership. There are some mechanics dealing with hiring contractors, and the main stat you're worried about with them is their loyalty rating. If they're harboring a secret motivation, then they will always fail a loyalty save when it comes in conflict with that motivation. Really, one of the main reasons to have contractors is to have a backup character ready to play when a main PC gets killed. The Warden's operation manual is the game master's guide for Mothership, and I have to tell you from the outset that it's really one of the best GM guides I've ever come across. I don't want to cover every last bit of this 60-page booklet since I'm going to include it in a separate video, but I do want to give you an idea here of what makes this guide a really valuable treasure if you're looking to improve your GM skills and sensibilities. I think the most intriguing thing that this manual does is walk you through how to prep a session of Mothership as if you've never even heard of a role-playing game before. And that might sound like the book is being condescending or patronizing, but it's not like that at all. It really feels like a fresh, ground-up approach to prepping a game, any game really, where you want to minimize prep, or at least zero in on what's important to you, by starting with the minimum and working your way out towards more complexity as needed. Step 1, buy a blank notebook. Step 2, write index on the first page and roster on the last page. Then on page 2, write session 1 prep. Then choose or come up with a scenario. For Mothership, there are 10 suggested types of scenarios that you can obviously combine or change as desired. These pretty much cover all of your alien, generic, sci-fi story scenarios. Then come up with the plot cycle that is composed of a transgression, where someone accidentally or on purpose awakens the horror, with a capital H, from its slumber. Omens, which are signs and signals of the horror's arrival. Manifestation, where the PCs finally meet or become fully aware of the horror. Then banishment, where the PCs fight or run away from or somehow defeat or survive the horror. And finally, slumber, where the horror is defeated or banished, but only for now. Because this is the horror genre where you always have to leave the door open for a sequel. Again, I'm going to blast past a lot of primo advice and breakdowns in this manual because I don't want to give everything away, but I will say, maybe as a criticism, that some of this stuff simply can't be internalized by just reading it. For example, you can't just read this list of social pressures and somehow know how to leverage them on players. It really takes a lot of actual running of games. Maybe another issue I had was here with these puzzle components. It's a great list, but I would have loved to have seen some examples of each puzzle type. Anyway, back to our notebook. Turn to a new page and label one side allies and the other side enemies. As the players progress through the story, you will list and briefly describe NPCs that they encounter. As the manual puts it, it won't be long before both pages are full and the game starts to run itself. On another spread in your notebook, you'll label it the name of a location and then draw 10 boxes. Each box represents a significant location rather than a room in a floor plan, and each location is connected by a way to get there. And that can be something like a hallway or even something like a jump gate in space. The point is that you're trying to identify where a scene will take place. Number each of these places and then write out a key on the right, keeping in mind that your key needs to be written in short phrases or sentences. The shorter, the better. Here's another map that you can include in your notebook, one that is much larger in scale. You're not trying to map out every planet and moon across 3 solar systems or whatever, just the locations where your players would visit and the ways they would get there. Mapping out factions are important if you're running a multi-session story or campaign and there is more than one faction in that story. The idea here is to succinctly identify the most important NPCs, where they can be found, and their goals. You can tick off goal completion in a number of ways, but I was immediately reminded of Ironsworn and Starforged by Sean Tompkin, where characters and quests and factions all have these progression tracks that mark their way toward a state of fulfillment or completion. On the opposite page, you can sketch out a relational map between factions. Here's the format for after you're done with a session. This is very straightforward and contains the most useful information of all: what worked and didn't work in the session. Obviously, it would be best to get input from the players on these items. Here's a really great section about the nature of making house rules. It gets a little nitty-gritty here, but the important things to remember about house rules are: make them consistent, make them easy to remember, and involve the players when you make them. This is one of the most important tables in the game, since it can shortcut you to some alternative rules that dial up or down the difficulty of the game itself. My personal favorite is the opt-in of stress, which allows players to voluntarily take on stress points when they feel it's appropriate, rather than it getting piled on them at every turn. Generally speaking, this table is a very strong indicator that this game has been extensively playtested over the years, and rather than the creators throwing away all of these rules and electing for one definitive version of the game, they give you this collection of rules as an array of levers that you can use to dial the game in to the exact feel that you want it to be. I'm going to gloss over a bunch more interesting advice, but I want to show you the 10 core tenets of this manual, designed as an adhesion contract that you're supposed to sign in the generically dystopian sci-fi universe the game takes place in. I think the most interesting thing about this list is that more than half of the principles can apply to all RPGs. This particular philosophy of GMing is not for everyone, but I do personally think that it's an extremely appealing way to approach running an RPG. The Shipbreaker's Guide is the third core gamebook that I wanted to cover, but only briefly. It's a 44-page booklet that covers all the rules for shipbuilding and ship combat in the game. There are a couple of dilemmas presented by the whole notion of players having or running their own ship. The first is that this is a game of survival horror, where PCs are going to die or go insane with some frequency, so their lack of longevity conflicts with the notion of going into the minutia of owning and or operating a spaceship. The second is that the costs for repair and upgrades are so exorbitant that it's just out of reach for most PCs, unless the GM throws millions of dollars at them, at which point you have to wonder what kind of game you're playing. That being said, there is a use case for players coming into a fortune in this game and running a ship. And maybe more importantly, anytime you make a space RPG that doesn't have ship combat rules, you're going to have a contingent of players clamoring online for those rules. As far as ships in Mothership, the approach is pretty simplistic. Each ship has 3 core stats: thrusters, which pertains to any kind of movement check; battle, which is for all combat related checks; and systems, which covers all of the ship's systems not already covered. Each ship has a class rating from 0 to 5 and higher. The ship's class is extremely important in combat because if a ship is 2 classes higher than yours, you simply cannot defeat it in battle. The pecking order is very severe. There are all kinds of different ships presented with very short lists of stats, but I think the most remarkable thing about most of the ships is the fact that they all kind of look like this. Whether they're scrappy raiders or deep space exploration vehicles, they're all shaped like the ship from 2001: A Space Odyssey, which is an interesting aesthetic decision. By taking away the sexiness of spaceships in this game, you take away all of the allure of even messing around with these rules at all. All the stats are here, the crew capacities, the diagrams showing the different compartments, but using these ships in-game feels very sterile. And that's by design, I think. You're not supposed to feel cool flying around in space in Mothership. You're supposed to feel vulnerable, coasting on the dangerous edge of human exploration and existence. The only thing separating you from the deadly vacuum of space is a bit of radiation-shielded metal and maybe an emergency spacesuit. This jump liner is notable for a couple of reasons. One, it's one of the only kinds of ships that can take you from one star to another, which makes it expensive to ride. And it's also got 2 kinds of habitats, one for poor passengers and one for rich ones. This is kind of a perfect backdrop for a multi-session campaign, if you ask me. Like I mentioned, upgrades to your ship, especially major ones, are prohibitively expensive. I guess as the GM, you can throw millions around as much as you want, but you don't want to destroy your in-game economy. And then there's the base cost of actually refueling and resupplying a ship. PCs are not always responsible for this, it should be noted. If the ship is owned by a corporation or a faction like the military, then the players don't even have to see this aspect of the ship's operation. I think one aspect of ships in this game that seem off to me are the ranges. There are 3 ranges: detection range, where the other ship is in the same star system; firing range, where 2 ships are within weeks of each other; and contact range, where they're within a few days of each other. These ranges just don't feel like the 3 definitive ranges I'd want to work with if I were running a game with ships. I think my space range sensibilities are couched in what is depicted in The Expanse, where ships are a meaningful distance away from each other in terms of hundreds of miles at most to maybe hundreds of yards. Unfortunately, these three ranges permeate the rules for ship combat, which themselves have some rough edges. For example, when you take a shot at another ship, you roll a battle check, and if you fail, then your ship takes 1 mega damage no matter what, on top of whatever damage the opposing ship manages to deliver. Ultimately, it's just a system where you sort of trade blows without any tactics, which is fine. This is Mothership after all. But if you feel like these ship rules need a little more time in the oven, just understand that it's going to have to be your oven that they finish baking in. All right, let's get down to it. Mothership versus Free League's Alien, point by point. Production. Internal layout. The Alien books have been widely criticized for wasting a lot of space with all the text boxes and just luxurious use of space for artwork. And I think that's a fair criticism. It's actually a pretty fun experience to read a book that is laid out like this, but the minute you're at the table trying to find a rule, it's the worst. Mothership, on the other hand, is about as efficient as you can get, while also utilizing black and white contrasting to maximum effect. 2 points to Mothership. Artwork. On the one hand, I really appreciate Mothership's variety of interesting artwork from all of the talented artists who contributed to the books, with a couple of exceptions where the sketches seem woefully unfinished. On the other hand, the artwork in Alien all seems unfinished. It all looks like the almost completed draft version of something really awesome. But the one thing that Alien has that Mothership does not in the art department is consistency. The jarring lack of consistency in art styles in Mothership just doesn't do it for me. 1 point for Alien. Physical product. Free League has long delivered on excellent print quality, and the maps and tokens for the Alien stuff are great. However, their glue-bound rules books included in the box sets actually come apart after just 1 or 2 sessions of play. Not sure if you knew that. I think that's enough to counter the fact that all the Mothership books are staple bound. This one's a tie, no points awarded. Game mechanics, dice resolution. Alien uses a D6 dice pool that includes specially colored stress dice as you pick up more stress. The stress dice add to your chance of success, which happens when you roll a 6, but introduces a chance of making a panic roll. Mothership is a roll under percentile die system, coupled with a roll over D20 panic check roll. I think in terms of tidiness in design, Alien has the more straightforward and robust approach. A point for Alien. Stress and panic. Stress is the central mechanic in both games. Did one game borrow from the other? I'm not here to say. I will say that a stress mechanic is only as good as what it culminates into, and in both games, it's a roll on the panic table. When comparing Alien's panic table to Mothership's, I tend to slightly prefer Mothership's for being less imposing on the player's agency. 1 point for Mothership. Wounds. If you have to roll on the wounds table in most Free League games, including Alien, you quickly find out that it's kind of random what kind of wound you'll end up with, whereas the wounds table in Mothership is much more granular and at least tries to meet you halfway in the fiction. A point for Mothership. Shore leave. Mothership tries to tackle the interlude between missions by providing a shore leave roll that can reduce stress and increase stats, as well as an opportunity to hire contractors. Honestly, I wish there were more tables to flesh out shore leave, even if they were purely narrative in nature. Alien doesn't really have any intermission mechanics. A point for Mothership. Ship combat and operation. Both games have rules for ship combat. Alien's rules involve specific skill rolls and 5 ranges, as well as rolls for an assigned pilot, gunner, and engineer. Mothership's combat between ships is pared down to the bone. However, Alien doesn't account for refueling or resupply costs. You just fly around anywhere you want and shoot ships or whatever and then keep flying. Mothership takes into account refuel and supply costs, as well as actual repair bills and the constant threat of bankruptcy and predatory lenders. This one's a wash, no points awarded. Classes. Mothership core rules give you 4 classes inspired by the Alien movies. They are largely defined by their starting stats, saves, and skills, and to a lesser degree their starting gear. Alien core rules give you 9 classes, defined really by their career-specific talents that may come up once or twice in a session. Mechanically, it's a toss-up, but thematically and narratively, Alien's wider variety of classes invoke more storytelling and character concept possibilities. A point for Alien. Monster stats and attacks. Monsters in both games are meant to be overwhelmingly deadly and to be avoided whenever possible. When you look up a monster for Alien, you get some stats and maybe most importantly, a D6 table for a random attack with standardized descriptions. In Mothership's, I guess, official monster manual, unconfirmed contact report, reports. When you look up a monster, you get a compressed line of stats and a random creative writing entry. A point for Alien. Illustrations. With Mothership, the monster illustrations can be interpreted as genius or as art school detritus, depending on how you look at it. The illustrations for the Alien RPG have pretty much one flaw, and that's that you can never get enough of them. A point for Alien. Setting. The setting for Alien is the 20th Century Fox officially licensed setting from the Alien movies, comics, and video games. Mothership is clearly inspired by Alien, but if you read the GM's guide, the game blows the door wide open to all kinds of possibilities, not just Alien universe stuff. And just as a bonus, the GM advice in Mothership is insanely good, whereas the advice in Alien is just serviceable. A point for Mothership. Third-party licensing. Mothership has a generous third-party license that has led to countless new inspirations, including maybe most notably the standalone RPG Cloud Empress, the creator of which I've interviewed on my newsletter. I'll leave that down below, but also several award-winning adventure modules and just a bunch of other cool stuff like Drain, Meat Grinder, Graveyard of the Gods, Piece by Piece, Bloom, The Black Dog, Desert Moon of Karth, Abilities Considered Unnatural. The list goes on and on. These are all extremely creative, inspiring, thought-provoking supplements that only really exist because of the Mothership third-party license. Alien RPG has no third-party license for obvious reasons. Alien is a high-dollar intellectual property that itself is already being licensed to Free League under what I would guess is a long list of restrictions. To be fair, Free League has released their underlying game rules, the Year Zero engine, for free use. And they also have an online market where you can publish stuff under some of their IPs if you give them something like 50% of each sale. But comparing apples to apples here, the actual game Mothership versus Alien, Mothership has the third-party license and Alien doesn't. A point for Mothership. Final score, 7 for Mothership, 5 for Alien. So there you have it, my completely unscientific, woefully biased opinion of Mothership versus Alien. I'd love to hear your take on the comparison or what your general experience has been with Mothership, as long as it has nothing to do with the delayed shipping of the Kickstarter rewards. And on this whole concept of this versus that, please note that even though I'm pitting these two games against each other, in the end, these companies are really on the same team. Independent and third-party game creators like Free League and Tuesday Night Games are all in the same boat. Their teams are small, their profits are small, and they're making games out of passion as much as anything. They're all trying to eke out a little bit of market share that is indisputably dominated by a corporation that has convinced millions of people that their mediocre fantasy RPG is not just the best game available, but the only one available. So with that in mind, please keep your comments civil. All the links for stuff are below. Thanks for watching. See ya.